Hello gamers and welcome back. I'm Rob, of course, or Warshak if you want to call me by my in-game name, and it's already been almost a month since the Ungoro has been released, and we've seen all kinds of new fun decks. We've played a whole bunch of new fun decks with our deck testings and deck guides, and it's about that time we hammer out a solidified monthly meta on all of the new most popular decks. Keep in mind, for those of you who are new and you've never seen a monthly meta before done by me, we talk about each class, and then within that class we talk about, again, kind of the most popular decks, and what I mean by this is when you queue into ranked play on Hearthstone, what are you going to be seeing 90 to 95% of the time when you hit that ranked button? And that's what we're going to go over. So the first class we are going to talk about is going to be the Warrior, but more specifically the Taunt Warrior. So this is definitely one of the most popular Warrior decks as of now, and one of just the most popular decks period right now on ladder. A lot of people have had a ton of success, including myself. This particular list is very close to the list I attained Legend with in the last season. In my opinion, it's very close to the Control Warrior in regards to kind of how you navigate throughout the game. But now there's actually some form of end game goal that we have, and that's completing the Fire Plume's Heart. And once we do that, we can basically throw 2 mana 8 damage or 2 mana 8 damage fireballs at our opponent until they slowly just wither away into a small pile of ash. So there's a lot of people who really like this deck. There's a lot of people who really don't like this deck, but without a doubt, it is definitely one of the most powerful out there in regards to just win rates and just its favorable matchups, right? And also keep in mind, guys, you may look at the deck and you could be like, Rob, why don't you have Sleep with the Fishes or have this or have that? These are my personal lists. If you don't like the list, feel free to change the list. But the foundation of the list is what's important, and that's Fire Plume's Heart, a bunch of good taunt minions, and a bunch of stall, basically, with cards like Brawl, Shield Slam, Execute, and cards of that nature. So very good Warrior deck right now, probably one of the best. Definitely, if you're thinking, you know, what do I play, Rob? Do I play Taunt Warrior or Pirate Warrior? It just comes down to what you're looking for. Taunt Warrior games are going to be a lot longer than the Pirate Warrior games, and your win rate might be a little bit higher, but you'll be able to play more Pirate Warrior games in the same amount of time as Taunt games. And if you can play more games quicker, even if your win rate is lower, theoretically you'll have more wins under your belt, therefore you'll rank up quicker. So moving to the next one, the Pirate Warrior list. I've gone ahead and last month, or not, I don't want to say last month, but our last monthly meta video, I kind of went off the broken path and did not put upgrades in the deck because I wasn't running upgrades, and that caused some huge upheaval, made a lot of people really upset. So here's the most basic Pirate Warrior deck I could possibly find for you guys. So hopefully there's no complaints in regards to changing any cards that would ever make this deck kind of your own. I couldn't respond to the comments fast enough in regards to trying to do something different with the deck. So here is the most standard Pirate Warrior list. Again, definitely a tier 1 deck in my opinion. If your opponent just doesn't have what they need to combat your early game, you win the match. End of story. Pirate Warrior is very consistent in regards to being able to draw your early game. From there, you've got huge weapons to swing in. It does a massive amount of damage, whether or not you're talking about bursts with Mortal Strikes, Arcane Reapers, Heroic Strikes, and that nature, or it has a lot of just minion burst potential with Frothing Berserker, the Elite, Naga Corsair, Leroy Jenkins. Overall, you know, still one of the strongest decks in my opinion, and very, very cheap in regards to the dust count. So heading on over to Warlock, we have the Handlock. Unfortunately, Handlock isn't one of the most it is popular among the Warlock decks, but unfortunately, it's not like, you know, when you go against Warlock, you're most likely going to be seeing some form of Zoo. But I still thought I should cover Handlock because if you see some form of control Warlock, you need to know kind of what you're going up against, and it's going to be something similar to the list you see here. It's going to be running Molten Giants, of course, the Twilight Drakes, the Elise, the Trailblazer. It's very late game, consists of Lord Draxus if you can't deal with its early games. Early game Giants and Twilight Drakes of that nature. This deck is pretty weak to aggressive based decks in my opinion, due to the fact that Reno Jackson has rotated out, and there's not a lot of healing. This deck depends solely on its being able to make big creatures like Twilight Drakes and Mountain Giants, and then giving those creatures taunt, which kind of act as health because you have to get rid of those creatures before attacking this deck directly. But very fun, very hard deck to play correctly. Has a lot of potential, but unfortunately with the meta being very, I don't want to say aggressive right now, but it's just fast paced with the Quest Rogue and the Pirate Warrior, plus even the Quest Warrior being able to throw 8 damage fireballs, and is just kind of, why would you play a Mountain Giant when you can just tap that hero power for 2 mana and deal 8 damage, while the Mountain Giant you actually have to set up to play. So this next list is going to be the Zoo Warlock. In my opinion, it's probably one of the most underrated decks right now. I feel like this deck has a lot of potential, and it's actually really good in regards to being able to combat not only the warrior decks, but also the rogue decks, because you kind of just swarm the board early on. The Quest Rogue doesn't have any sort of board clear. Their whole board clear is their minions trading into stuff when they become 5/5s. So with that, if you just swarm the board early on, you take them to 10 HP, and then you can just finish them off with a Doom Guard or, you know, a buffed Darkshire Councilman, you're good to go. So definitely very underrated. And for those of you unfamiliar with Zoo, just playing a bunch of small, very resilient or strong minions for their particular mana cost is how the deck kind of gets by, especially with this new Devilsaur Egg in combination with the Ravenous Paradox or Paradax. These two in synergy together are very, very powerful, and can give you a huge spike in tempo that particular turn. Plus the fact that you can use Defender of Argus and Abusive Sergeant on the egg to pop it, along with you can tuck it next to a Direwolf. Like, there's just a lot of good combos you can use this deck, and there's a lot of synergies that work well, especially feeding time with the Councilman or the Knife Juggler. I found to run 1 feeding time is good. I know it's not one of the strongest 5-drops, but it definitely takes your opponent off guard. I think if it could have hit face, the card would be almost a staple. But the fact that it only can be used on minions makes it so we only really have to play one of them, and it's good enough. All right, so heading on over to Shaman, we have this Jade Elemental Shaman. So there's going to be a couple shamans that we talk about. One is, of course, this Elemental Jade, and the next one's going to be straight Jade or straight Elemental. Both of the decks run almost identical. Besides, of course, one having that kind of Jade package swung in there. But again, it doesn't really change it too much if you had to pick one. And when we talk about the other one, I'll finish it up there. But just keep in mind, the decks are very similar in how they're run with just some minor Jade changes. So with this particular deck, with the loss of Tunnel Trog and Totem Golem, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in the last monthly meta video, it affected the early game of Shamans substantially. Shamans no longer have that very bursty start anymore with like Tunnel Trog, Totem Golem, Feral Spirits, you're dead by turn 4 or 5, right? That doesn't really exist anymore within the Shaman class. So now we're seeing more of an Elemental Shaman or Jade Shaman, which in the first couple turns of the game is very slow. Hero power, maybe a Firefly, not too much damage. Then it starts heading into turn 4 or 5, where we're being able to Jade Lightning, play Servant of Calamos. We're wrapping that up towards the late game with Fire Elementals, Blaze Callers, and Calamos the Primal Lord. Whether or not you run Bloodlust or not is kind of up to you. If you're facing a lot of control decks, Bloodlust is of course a fantastic card, but if you're playing against a lot of aggro like I've been, teching in, you know, 2 Hot Spring Guardians, a Devolve, trying to deal with the early game as much as possible is kind of what I aim to do in some of these Shaman decks that I'm building. And then if we look over, and of course, as we can see, the Jade package sprinkled in here. And for some of you who don't know what the Jade package is, it's just the double Jade Claws, the double Jade Lightning, and of course the Eye of Blackpaw. That's considered the Jade package. So looking at the next list, this would be kind of just the straight Elemental Shaman. As you can see, it does run 2 Jade Claws, only because that's one of kind of the best early game weapons in regards to it's still a 2-drop, 2/2 weapon, and it summons a creature, which you can't really go wrong with. On top of that, this particular package runs the Bloodlust and the Stone Shaper, which kind of helps out your middle game a little bit more, because with the Jades, it takes time for them to kind of get big. But while you can replace that lacking of time to get big versus just being able to play that 4-drop 3/5 taunt with the Divine Shield. So this deck would probably do a little bit better versus aggressive based decks, while the Jade package one would do a little bit better versus control decks. And the reason I say that is because we've even teched in the Bloodlust to give this deck a little bit of more of an edge versus control. that's why that's in there. So the next one's going to be the Control Shaman list. Not as popular as the two that we had just gone over, but definitely a deck you need to keep your eye out for because it can definitely sneak some wins in there. And it's very, very powerful against aggressive base decks. This deck is awful against Taunt Warrior, and I would have to say that's one of the main control decks that this deck cannot beat. But besides that, this deck is very good against Rogue. It's very good against Druid. It's very good against Shamans, other aggro Shamans, and it's also very good against, I'm missing one class, the Murloc Paladins, which are running around due to the fact that this deck has so much CC in it with Volcanoes, Lightning Storms, the Devolve, and of course the Maelstrom Portal in combination with whether or not you're going to be using Blood Mage, are just crazy field clears. From there, you follow it up with like Earth Elemental, you give it the Ancestral Spirit, and then you Faceless Manipulator, and you basically have two 7 attack 8 HP creatures that really no one can get through. Plus when they die, they bring themselves back. So that's kind of the combo of the deck. Plus you can of course go ahead and throw in N'Zoth if you really want, but I found that N'Zoth and sometimes it just kind of, it doesn't work out the best because then you'd have to run Karen Bloodhoof, and then you'd have to run maybe one more Death Rattle, and then it's a 10 mana card that sits in your hand. So I found that this is perfectly fine for the meta as of now, because this deck is going to lose to Warrior regardless of you playing N'Zoth or not. So why would you run a card that you don't have to increase them, to hopefully increase a matchup that you're unfavorable in, when even that increase doesn't make it substantial enough to put in there in the first place. So hopefully that made sense. So moving to the next list, we have the Murloc Shaman, which is more of a meme deck than anything, but it's still popular amongst the ranks of, I want to say like 10 to 15, even 5 to 15. I've seen a decent amount of this Murloc Shaman running around, and that's just because it has a very explosive start and a very explosive ending. Whether or not you're playing Bloodlust or not, I've chose not to due to the fact that we do run the Megasaur, which is kind of not like a Bloodlust, but it has the ability to buff all of the Murlocs, and it's a decent sized body in itself. And of course the Finja in here, the whole deck's kind of rudimentary in the fact that it doesn't need much explaining because you're trying to accomplish the same thing every game. You unite the Murlocs, you play 10 Murlocs, you get Megafin, you play Megafin, then you dump your hand again. So not too much explaining there, but a deck that I figured I need to kind of show off in regards for those of you who are wanting to see that particular deck list. Moving to the Rogue, we have, of course, the Quest Rogue here. This is my most recent rendition, very, very close to the deck guide one we had just gone over. The only difference here is I removed one Alkalite of Pain and added one more Glacial Shard because there's a lot. With it being the new season, at the start of the season, there's going to be a lot of Pirate Warriors, a lot of other Rogues, and a lot of those Murloc Paladin decks, so adding another freeze effect with the Glacial Shard I think is pretty important to be able to survive and keep your minions alive. But besides that, as we know, I just went over the deck guide on this not too long ago. Bouncing back cards to the hand, being able to complete the quest as soon as possible, because basically without this quest completed, your deck literally does nothing. All of the cards kind of just suck, but when you make them all 5/5s for their respective mana costs, all of a sudden this deck becomes crazy. So completing that quest as soon as possible is this deck's #1 goal, and the quicker you can do that, the more powerful your deck will be, and the more powerful deck the more powerful your deck is, the quicker you can kind of wrap up the game and win. So again, this, if you're going to say, hey Rob, what are kind of the two main biggest decks right now? I was going to say the Quest Rogue and the Quest Warrior are two decks that you can kind of build, and you won't be disappointed with the results, and they're kind of like, you know, the top tier decks right now. I'm sure a couple other decks are top tier as well, but these kind of shine more brightly due to the fact that they seem to be a lot more popular and a little bit easier to play. You know, this is not one of the hardest decks in Hearthstone to play. There's some turns they'll have a lot of intricacies into figuring out which cards you do and do not need to return based up on the matchup and what you currently have in your hand, but for the most part the game plan of this deck does not change on who you're playing against, or if it changes, it does very minimally. Moving to the next deck is going to be a much harder deck, probably one of the hardest decks to play correctly right now, including Freeze Mage, which we haven't gone over but will, is going to be the Miracle Rogue. There's kind of two renditions to this. One of them runs Malygos, one of them doesn't. I particularly like the Arcane Giant version due to the fact that Malygos it's kind of expensive, and if you can play 2 Arcane Giants for that cheap cost of, you know, 1 to 3 mana on top of having Shears and the Corpse Flower on the board, it's just kind of like a lot of damage your opponent has to get rid of. Plus, on top of that, you're doing chip damage for the whole game in regards to, you know, your Abysses making a big Edwin, your Corpse Flower, and also all of your Razor Petal volleys. So just overall, very strong deck right now if played correctly. Again, one of the harder decks to play in regard that Miracle Rogue has always been a fairly difficult deck to play in respect to some of the other decks that have been around. Also with the Vile Spine Slayer, it added a new ability to be able to have a good single target removal, because that's what really Rogue lacked, right? Because its single target removal wasn't removal, it was sap, right? We'd sap a Tyrion back to our opponent's hand, or sap an 8/8 back to their hand, and they'd have to replay it the next turn. And during that turn that they're replaying it, we would try to push as much damage as we can to try to beat them before that card actually became useful. But now we've got cards like the Slayer. This allows us to kind of navigate the game a little bit more differently, and a little bit take a little bit more of not an aggressive stance, but just have the ability to deal with minions that we couldn't normally deal with before. So this deck definitely has a spot as being one of the better decks in the meta right now, and has even better chance if played, you know, by someone who really enjoys this deck and knows what they're doing. So our next deck class that we're going to talk about, hold on, I need a sip, is going to be the N'Zoth Priest. So as Priest not being one of the most powerful classes right now, especially the Death Rattle Priest, which its quest is really not so great in comparison to, of course, the Rogue and the Warrior, because I guess I'll break this down. So if we look at the Warrior quest, when completed, 2 mana, 8 damage every turn, with consistent value over the course of however long the game remains. We look at Rogue, everything turns into a 5/5 forever, consistent value. We look at Priest, turn set your hero power, or set your hero's health to 40. While as good as that sounds, and as good as you think it sounds, it doesn't really matter, because if you're getting hit by 5/5s every turn, it doesn't really matter what your health is. It didn't help you deal with the board. It didn't help you get more value with your hand. It didn't help you generate anything. All it did was give you health, which can be easily taken away with a 2 mana deal 8 damage every turn, or an army of 5/5s, right? So this deck heavily requires you to get kind of, I don't want to say lucky, but you need to get good cards from the cards that this deck steals from your opponent, like the Crystalline Oracle, the Shifting Shade, and stuff like that. It also depends very heavily on its Shadow Visions. So if you just have games where your RNG isn't the best and you're not getting really good cards from these card generation abilities, the deck is severely crippled and weakened. Meanwhile, if you look at Warrior, the cards do what they say, and your hero power does what it does every single turn. There's no RNG to that besides where it hits, but it doesn't really matter where it hits, because eventually you're gonna die. Taking 8 damage for 2 mana is insane. So that's kind of why the Priest isn't really that popular right now, is because just in comparison to some of the other value quests, it doesn't even stand a chance. Like, it's not even in the same category. And that's why N'Zoth Priest. But I guess the point of the deck, which I didn't really go over, I just explained how shitty it was, was the fact that you'd play all these Death Rattles, right? You complete the quest, you play it, you make your hero power's health 40, you play N'Zoth, and you basically just outvalue your opponent. The whole deck is basically just outvaluing throughout the whole game. Very controlly. Moving to the next one is Dragon Priest, which I think is one of the more consistent and a very powerful deck at that. I actually thought this deck would be completely dead once the new expansion hit, because we lost Blackrock Mountain, which means we lost so many of the most powerful dragons. You know, we lost Twilight Guardian, we lost Blackwing Corruptor, we lost Technician, we lost the Little Drake, the 1 mana 2/3 dragon. So we lost a lot in this most recent Hearthstone standard rotation, but this deck has still shined through. So it kind of follows the same exact game plan that Dragon Priest has always followed, and that's curve out exceedingly well by playing decent minions. So you always start with, of course, the Cleric, Power Ward, Shield, followed by the Curious Glimmerroot, which is actually really good card. And in one of our videos, we were actually able to Curious Glimmerroot the opponent's quest, and it happened to be a rogue, and then we actually completed our opponent's rogue quest and beat them with their own quest, which was a crazy funny game and a super awesome highlight. So for those of you who saw that, they saw the fun, and for those of you who want to see it, I think I put it in our highlight section, but it was a crazy game, super fun, and this deck has the potential is basically unlimited, and due to the fact that you can kind of steal whatever you want with the Curious Glimmer Root, or not whatever you want, but good cards, and be able to combo with that. Also, the Dragonoid Operative holds this deck together. Without the Operative, I don't think this deck would be a thing, but the fact that Operative is still around and being able to also get Operative with your Netherspite Historian is huge. Playing 4 Operatives can just win you a game in total because it's a 5 mana, 5/6. Stats are already there. It's a huge minion. Plus, you get to discover a card from your opponent's deck, which means you get to, like with the Glimmer Root, it tells you what card you're getting if you pick it correctly. With the Operative, you just take whatever card you want, and you can pick the you know, out of those 3 options. So really powerful deck, and Operative is really what holds it together. Moving to the next deck is going to be the Meme Priest, or also known as the Silence Priest. This deck revolves around basically one combo and one combo only to win the game, unless you're going against aggro, at which you could just make a big taunt wall and they'll concede, because the second warrior see taunt, they go, oh my god, can't go face, gotta Kansami da. But against normally any other deck that isn't aggro, your win condition is playing like an Ancient Watcher, the Razor Leaf, and or the where is it? Did I not include it in here? I guess I didn't. Normally you would play also the Faceless Shambler, and you would copy one of the bigger creatures. You go like double Divine Spirit or 1 Divine Spirit, and normally like a Talon Priest, and then you would inner fire it. I wonder why I left out the Faceless Shambler in here. Normally I always put that in there. I must have had a reason, because I took this deck list, imported it right off of my normal deck list. I must have been drunk. Either way, the deck will still run the same. Maybe I didn't want the Shambler. I don't know. Whatever the case may be. The deck is a meme deck, but it's still a deck that seems to be very popular right now and wins through just being able to, again, double Divine Spirit, copying or doubling the card's health. So they make... For example, right, we'll go Humongous Razor Leaf. It has 8 HP. They go Divine Spirit. It goes to 16. And then they inner fire it, and it's a 16/16. It goes face. You had no counterplay. Or... in my case, they'll go double Divine Favor, and it'll have 32 HP, and then they'll inner fire, and then it'll have 32 attack, and then we'll just get wrecked. But for the most part, it's kind of, I don't want to say a hard combo to pull off, but it's more of a meme than a consistent deck. Moving to Paladin, there's quite a few Paladin decks running around, and there's going to be some decent amount to cover. So first one's first is the N'Zoth Paladin. For some of you may say, Rob, N'Zoth Paladin isn't popular. It may be the least popular among the Paladin decks, but it is going to become more popular as time moves on, because people will realize that this deck is really good right now. It has the ability to not only combat the early game cards like or the early game decks like the Pirate Warrior, you know, the Rogues and all that good stuff, and the Token Druid, but it also has the ability to kind of pilot towards the late game and outvalue some of the more decks that we wouldn't think it could outvalue, like the Taunt Warrior deck. With cards like N'Zoth, Tyrion, and Karen Bloodhoof, it makes it really difficult for the Warrior to be able to deal with this deck. Because of just the amount of strong creatures, it only has so much removal, right? Especially with only running 2 executes, and no for the people aren't running Shield Slams, they run Sleep with the Fishes, and Sleep with the Fishes is it's better against more aggressive based decks than decks that most of the cards have above 6 HP. So you'll actually find you'll be able to pull off some sick wins against some Taunt Warriors with this particular list, especially with how greedy I've built it. So again, N'Zoth is your main game plan, with the remainder of the deck being very control-y and outvalue-y. This next one is going to be the this is the more aggressive Murloc Paladin. So there's 2 Murloc Paladin builds right now. There's one that's more of a control Murloc Paladin, and then there's one more that's very aggressive. I don't want to say very aggressive, but much more aggressive. With this being the more aggressive version. So the Tide Callers, the Tide Caller, the Tide Hunter, and of course the Murloc Tide Hunter is going to be in combination with the Steward of Darkshire. I don't know why I'm having a hard time, because they all have fucking Tide Caller. I mean, they're all Tide Hunters and Tide Callers and Rip Pool Hunters. Anyway. In combination with the Steward of Darkshire, it makes these cards really hard to kill. Plus, you're summoning 2 Murlocs a turn, and both of them have Divine Shield. And then you've got like War Leaders, and you've got the Cold Light Seers, and you've got the Megafin, or not the Megafin, but the Gentle Megasaur. There's just so much synergy in this deck that if your opponent leaves up any minions at all, even if it's just 2 or 3 Murlocs, they're gonna be buffed the next turn, and buffed the next turn, and buffed the next turn. And after they're getting buffed and you've run out of cards, you just play Divine Favor and redraw all of the cards that you've lost, because most of the cards in this deck are pretty cheap to play. So this deck runs very much so like an aggro paladin, but you've got synergy within almost every card of the deck. And let's say you draw all of your cheap Murlocs and none of your buffers, no problem. You have Sunkeeper Tarim to come in here and make all your Murlocs 3/3s. And then for the late game, you can play Tyrion or Rag. I run both just because I'm like that. I like the value of both of these, because if we play against another like burn deck, I like having at least one form of heal in the deck, because there is a control aspect to this deck. But if you want to change out the Rag the Light Lord with something else, be my guest, but this is my particular build. Oops. So our next deck is going to be the more control-y Murloc Paladin, which is more so my favorite. I don't really like running too much of the aggro-based decks, but I will from time to time. But this deck definitely has a lot more potential in being able to beat some of those more late-game decks. Not that our first aggressive Murloc deck can't. I just prefer, again, the more control-y decks, and has kind of the same kind of go-to cards with the Hydrologist, the Rippool Hunter, but instead of running some of those more like duplicate Murloc cards that summon 2 of them, I'm running like Aldor Peacekeeper. You know, we're running Ivory Knights and the Steeds instead, and we're also running 2 Drakes with Curator. So there's a lot of draw in here, there's a lot of value, and overall it has the ability to, again, burst out your opponent in the early game. If we start with like Vilefin Inquisitor, you know, Hydraulis Rockpool into the Murloc War Leader into Megasaur, sure, there's plenty of potential there, but it also has a backup game plan here where it also runs very high-end late-game minions, which are very helpful. So looking at Mage right now probably has the most decks out of anything that we can play, due to the fact that there's so much variety, whether you're playing, you know, Quest Mage, Tempo Mage, Elemental Mage, Control Mage, Freeze Mage, Exodia Mage. The list goes on. The first deck we are going to talk about is going to be this Control Mage, though. One of my definitely favorites out of all of the mages to play right now, because again, you know me, I like my control decks. Hold on. Okay, so with this being the Control Mage, it aims to kind of do exactly a mixture of things. So it has the same identity of Freeze Mage, Tempo Mage, and Ultimate Value Mage, all stuffed into one, right? Because we have the ability to discover tons of cards with the Courier, the Babbling Book, and the Firelands Portal and things like that. From there, it has the value orientation to it, like the Medivhs and the Meteor and the Primal Glyph, which can give us tomes. And then from there, it has more of the Freeze Mage aspect with the Pyroblast, the Alexstrasza, the Volcanic Potion, the Ice Barriers and Ice Blocks. So it's really a combination of multiple different types of mage into one, and it actually works out really, really well. You'd be like, Rob, but what is the win condition? I don't really see anything here. I just see a bunch of stuff that does things, but nothing really that wins. And this deck just outvalues, it chips at your opponent. You go with the Alexstrasza Pyroblast combo for the victory a lot of time. Medivh gives you a lot of victories a lot of time, or just being able to get good glyphs into more Pyroblasts or Frostbolts or Fireballs or Tomes. It's just this deck is just insane. And it actually works out really well, like I mentioned. So one of my favorites, and definitely I want to say at least tier 2. So looking at this list, we've seen it oh so much since the start of Hearthstone, I guess I should say. Freeze Mage has always been a deck that's been kind of at the top of the food chain in regards if it's played correctly and piloted by someone who's very confident in their Freeze Mage abilities. This deck can easily get you to wherever rank you're trying to achieve, again, if played correctly. The problem, though, is that this deck is extremely hard to play correctly. This is one of the hardest decks in the game, in my opinion. And if you're not really familiar with the deck and you're trying to pilot it and you just keep losing, it kind of makes sense, because again, really hard to play, and has a lot of bad matchups if you're unaware of what you're supposed to do in particular situations. The reason, though, it's popped back up in popularity is the Arcanologist here allows you to basically draw secrets from your deck, which makes it so you're not drawing dead draws, because drawing secrets feels incredibly bad. When Mad Scientist was a thing, it would actually pull the secret from your deck and put it into play. While the Archaeologist isn't that good, it's still like a replica of what old Mad Scientist used to be, allowing the deck to thrive once again and be pretty powerful. So definitely two very powerful decks with the Control Mage and of course the Freeze Mage. I don't think Freeze Mage will ever go anywhere. Even without Ice Lances, this deck is still crazy, which should tell you something. This is the Exodia Mage, which follows the same kind of route as Freeze Mage, but just relies on a different win condition. Instead of using Alexstrasza or slowly chipping at your opponent with Fireballs and Pyroblasts and all that good stuff, this deck goes with the double Sorcerer's Apprentice. You Molten Reflection both those Sorcerer's Apprentice, so now you have 4 Sorcerer's Apprentice. From there, you are completing your quest, or your legendary quest, which gives you the ability to skip your opponent's turn. You play Archmage, you play spells. Your Fireballs cost 4 mana because you have 4 Sorcerer's Apprentice out. They cost no mana, and then you just keep fireballing over and over and over again until your opponent dies, because Archmage says whenever you play a spell, he copies, or he doesn't copy, whenever you play a spell, generate a fireball. So as long as you have one spell to kind of start the combo, he's always going to make fireballs, and as we know, fireballs will cost 0 because of Sorcerer's Apprentice. The problem with this combo is it requires a lot of cards. It requires you to hang on to both your apprentices, both your Molten Reflections, have Archmage, also not be dead, along with being able to complete the quest and wrapping it all up into a 2-turn combo. So you have to use your ability to kind of freeze the board, stall the game, and draw lots of cards to stop your opponent from winning, getting the combo in hand, and then of course executing that combo in a timely manner before your opponent kills you, or you just, you know, die. So I wouldn't say a very consistent deck, but I would say very fun. I would say if you're looking to play some form of mage like this, I would say just run Freeze Mage or Control Mage, because the deck will be more consistent. It's not as cool as being able to make a million fireballs and kill your opponent from whatever health they're at, but at the same time, if you're looking to play an exceedingly hard deck that wins, you know, in 1 to 2 turns, I think Freeze Mage or Control Mage is the way to go. Exodia Mage is more, again, just kind of like a meme deck, very similar to the Priest deck that we had gone over. This next one is going to be our Elemental Tempo Mage deck. It's not a 1 to 2 turn killer like a lot of the decks that we had just discussed. Its closest relative, I would have to say, is the Tempo Mage in regards to being able to play minions every turn or have something to do every turn. So of course, in the early game, Babbling Book, Mana Worm into Cult Sorcerers, Sorcerer's Apprentice into Pyros. From there, you get your Steam Surgers, your Water Elemental, then you go for your Servant of Calamos, and then Blazecaller and Firelands Portal to finish up your opponent. A lot of value in this deck in regards to the Servant and the Primal Glyphs that allow you to kind of generate whatever you're looking for. The only weakness of this deck is the fact that there's not really any synergy with playing spells like we saw before with Tempo Mage. Flame Waker was a really big important card in the deck, and we would actually save a lot of our cheap spells and combo them with Flame Waker to deal, you know, a crazy amount of damage in 1 turn. Unfortunately, this deck no longer has that. It depends on its elementals to generate value instead of being able to generate value through actually playing the spells. So it's kind of like you're substituting out the burst that Flame Waker would give for the value that Servant or Blazecaller gives, which is not, it's a hit or miss. Some games it works out well, some games it doesn't work out well. The problem with this deck is that if you just don't draw your elementals, they kind of just sit in your hand and don't really do too much. But most of the time you're able to kind of get on the elemental I don't want to say bandwagon, but snowball effect, because once you play your Servant of Calamos, you know, then you could coin in Blazecaller. Once you play one Blazecaller, you can play another Blazecaller, or you can play your other Servant or a Steam Surger. And once you play Steam Surger, you get your Flame Geyser, which makes another elemental. So it's kind of just like once you get the snowball rolling, you're good. But getting that initial push is what sometimes could be sometimes difficult for this particular deck. So looking at Hunter, everybody thought that Quest Hunter would be the bee's knees, the big dick swinger of the set. Unfortunately, the Quest Hunter is actually one of the shittiest decks and one of the worst quests you can actually get in regards to Midrange Hunter, which we have here, just overall being a stronger deck than the Quest Hunter, due to the fact that Hunter, as we know, is a deck that requires, it's always been fast-paced. We're trying to kill our opponent as soon as possible, and with the quest that kind of gets in the way with playing a bunch of 1-drops that die easily, we're not really doing as much damage as we could. Even if we play the 8/8, then it's just very slow and inconsistent. Midrange Hunter, consistent. we know what it does, and it does it well most of the time. So in this particular build, curving out exceedingly well. Most of the time we have a 1-drop, we have a 2-drop, we have a decent 3-drop into a 4-drop, and then our 5 drops Tundra Rhino into Savannah Highmane. That's the ideal curve, and most of the time the curve is there because we have we're not running any, you know, 7, 8, or 9, or 10 drops in the deck. So we're capping out at 6, which means the chances and probability of drawing the earlier game cards and having multiple of them to fill out our curve in the early game is increased exponentially. So for those of you running a fairly easy deck to play that's relatively cheap, I mean 2,000 dust to hit legend doesn't feel to be that bad. And this is definitely a deck that can do it. A lot of questions are, Rob, you know, can these decks hit legend? Yes, most of the decks that we go over today, I would say can hit, like, you know, Meme Priest and Exodia Mage, probably not the best decks to go hit legend with. But, you know, Quest Rogue, Quest Warrior, Midrange Hunter, those are all fine decks to hit legend with. I mean, these are the best. There's a reason why they're as popular as they are. So the next one's going to be the Druid class, and that's going to be the Ramp Druid. This is one of my favorite lists to play right now. Again, maybe not the most competitive deck we could bring to the table, but definitely a very interesting, and if the deck does what it's supposed to do, which is ramp and then play big minions, if it accomplishes that, there's not a lot of decks that can beat it. I mean, being able to Giant Anaconda out a 12/12 can't be targeted by hero powers or spells. I mean, what kind of Alamau is someone supposed to do? I mean, they just kind of have to accept the fact that a 12/12 Tyrantus is going to come at their face, and they just kind of hit that sweet Kansamida button, and we get to queue up into the next game. The problem lies with this deck is that if you draw all of your big minions and none of your ramp, which happens more times than not, surprisingly, even though we have double Innervate, double Wild Growth, double Jade Blossom, double Mire Keeper, double Nourish, all of those cards allow us to either draw more cards or to ramp, and for some reason, we always seem to never draw those cards. But most of the time, when you play against other people playing this deck, they normally get the ramp they need to succeed. But either way, very strong deck. We actually recently did our deck guide on it, and it proved to be very powerful. Even against, you know, Pirate Warrior, if we get a decent ramp curve, you know, the second you start throwing down Bog Champs, your opponent concedes because there's a taunt in the way. So looking at this next list is going to be the Token Druid. Again, I would definitely consider this to be one of the highest, I wouldn't say the highest of tier decks, but a very powerful deck to play right now. Due to the fact that it takes sweet advantage of the fact that Quest Warrior, Quest Rogue, and the slower Paladins / slower, there's one more deck, Shaman decks. It takes advantage of the fact that they don't really do much until turn 4 or 5, and this deck does everything until turn 4 or 5. So if they can't keep up with what you're throwing down, very similar to Zoo, you know, swarming the board with little resilient minions, buffing them up with like such as Mark of the Lotus, Power of the Wild, Savage Roaring them. It's just huge burst damage, hits the ground running from turn 1 on. And very, very difficult deck to beat if your opponent does not draw what their early game is. You know, normally a lot of decks will run some form of early game removal. Like if we're playing against a Druid, they would have Wrath, you know, Swipe, things of that nature, even Doomsayers. If we're playing against Mage, Frostbolt, things like that. But if they just don't draw that stuff, you win the game because they can't kill your minions and they're going to do way too much damage. And as soon as it hits, you know, turn 4 or 5 and you're adding on Defender of Arguses and Savage Roars, there's not much they can do. And even if they clear the board, you've got stuff like Living Mana in here to kind of refill your board. And if they don't have a second board clear, you're in the clear at that point too. So very powerful, interesting deck. I didn't think Token Druid would be like, you know, a really top tier deck. But surprisingly, Token Druid has made its way to the top and is very popular and very powerful right now. There was something else I wanted to add, but it's not coming to mind. Oh yes, you're wondering why one Innervate. Everything in the, like, there's going to be no cards in this deck that we're ever going to Innervate instead of Living Mana or Finja. Those are really the only two cards that we really need to Innervate, and top decking an Innervate is like one of the worst things that could ever happen in this deck once we get to the late game, because this deck has literally no draw mechanic. There's no draw in this deck, and that is because it's an aggro deck, and we don't need to draw, we need to go face. So I figured one Innervate is fine. Heading into the last deck we have, guys, and that's going to be the Jade Golem Druid. So a deck that's been around, again, since Mean Streets, very simplistic in its nature. It's trying to achieve the same thing basically every game. We ramp in the early game. The late game consists of us summoning Jades as many as possible, as fast as possible, with never fatiguing because we have a card called Jade Idol. On top of that, we've added in, I don't say we added in, it's a very common ad now, but it's the auctioneer to be able to draw more cards than normal. I mean, being able to auctioneer, innervate, Jade Idol, Jade Idol, Jade Idol, Jade Idol, Jade Idol. The list goes on. We just keep making a field full of Jades. We draw a ton of cards, and our opponent just cannot deal with that value. This is one of those decks that can actually beat the Taunt Warrior more times than not because of the fact that it has infinite value with the Jade Idol. There's not a whole lot of decks that can consistently beat Taunt Warrior, but this is one. However, there's a drawback. This deck, like I've mentioned, is very slow if you don't draw your ramp early on. So your beginning turns, let's say you draw like Jade Spirit, you know, Nourish, Aya Blackpaw, Jade Behemoth. You're not doing anything until turn 4, and even on turn 4, you're only summoning a 4 mana, what, 3/4? And that's nothing. By turn 4, most Pirate Warrior games, if you're playing against one, you're dead. So this deck, again, highly depends on you being able to draw your early game, your Wraths, your Feral Rages, your Jade Blossoms, your Wild Growths, your Swipes, and things like that. So where you take being able to have that sweet ultimate late game, you give up sometimes in the early game because you have those cards that allow you to win in this super controlling matchups. So yeah, well, that's going to wrap up our most popular decks of this month. If I've left anything out or you'd like to add on to anything I've said, feel free to in the comments section below. Of course, I can only cover so much in these videos, guys. And also keep in mind that a new video of the monthly meta is posted at the beginning of every month. So at the first of every month, you will be seeing this video. So as we move through the month and the later stages of the month, this video becomes more and more outdated. So if there's a particular deck that popped up 2 weeks from now, there's no fucking way I can include it in this video, right? So just don't yell at me in the comments like, Rob, why don't you have this deck in this video? It's because it is impossible. How am I supposed to know that the deck just became popular and it's not like I can add it? Sorry about that little rant there, but sometimes that comment pops up and I'm just like, how the hell do you expect me to fix that? So again, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video, if not the next monthly meta. I'm Rob, of course, or Warshack, and happy whatever the hell day it is.